Today I want to teach you about the fluid mosaic model. And the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane is what we're gonna have today. All right. Yeah, don't forget to like our videos, subscribe for more and better videos, and please share to other people to also enjoy the science we give here. All is well, let's continue. Alright, the fluid mosaic model. This was discovered by Singer and Carlson in 1972, just a few years back, and it was put forward by these two people as the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane, and it's the most accepted theory about the arrangement of molecules within the cell membrane. All right, and according to this model, if there is a phospholipid bilayer, which is uh, which is the basic continuous structure forming the cell membrane. The phospholipids are present in fluid form. Okay, they are in fluid form. Therefore, this fluidity makes the cell membrane quite flexible and thus allows cells to undergo considerable changes in shape without disruption of structural integrity. So being quite flexible is good. The cells can change shape without disruption of structure integrity. All right. And the proteins are present as discontinuous mosaic of globular proteins, which float about in the fluid phospholipid bilayer, forming a fluid mosaic pattern. Okay, so there is a fluid mosaic pattern which is formed when proteins are scattered discontinuous mosaic forms. Okay, and just as you can see this, all I'm going to speak about today is rotated about this point here. The peripheral proteins, as you can see here, they are proteins, they are carbohydrates, they are lipids. So all these three things are forming the cell membrane. Okay, so as you can see here, a lot we're going to talk about is about this. We're going to talk about the functions of each molecule. You see here, the proteins are scattered in a mosaic pattern, have carbohydrate side chain here on this protein, have proteins at the periphery and proteins which are traversing through, which are crossing the cell membrane. You can see this channel protein here. You have these peripheral proteins, you have this integral protein, and you have phospholipid molecules. It is a bilayer. There is this layer, and there is also this layer here, bilayer. Okay, and as you can see, it has some heads and the tail. That is a single phospholipid, a head and a tail. You can notice the way they face. If this is the cytosol and this is the extracellular matrix, and then we have the heads facing each of those, and the tails are facing the center of the cell membrane. All right, so let's continue. All right, that is it. So we're gonna look at the arrangement of different molecules in the cell membrane. Several molecules are arranged differently within the cell membrane. As you can see, let's start with the arrangement of the lipid bilayer. Each lipid molecule in the lipid bilayer of the cell membrane primarily consists of phospholipid, cholesterol, and glycolipids. Cholesterol has a couple of functions. Phospholipids are also important. The glycolipids are also important. And the lipid molecule is closest pin shape and consists of a head end and a tail. Okay, that is a phospholipid. And the head end, as you saw it up there, this head end is positively charged and is quite soluble in water, i.e. it is polar or hydrophilic. Okay, whereas the tail end consists of two chains of fatty acids or steroid radical cholesterol. Therefore, it is quite insoluble in water. You can say that the tail end is nonpolar or it is hydrophobic. All right. So let's continue. And these lipid molecules are arranged as a bilayer that we saw it in such a way that nonpolar hydrophilic tails are directed towards the center of the membrane, whereas their polar hydrophilic head ends are directed towards outwards or on either sides of the membrane. In this way, the head ends of the molecules face the aqueous phase. And by saying aqueous phase, I mean they face the extracellular fluid on the outside, or intercellular fluid in the cytoplasm or cytosol on the inside, on the inner side. So that is it. We saw it. That the heads are facing the aqueous environment, whereas the hydrophobic tails are facing the center of the phospholipid bilayer, center of the membrane. Okay, so it means there is attraction which calls about that arrangement. And the functional significance of this is that the arrangement makes it a semi-permeable membrane, which constitutes the major barrier for water-soluble molecules like electrolytes, urea, and glucose. Okay, it forms a barrier. Okay, so that these electrolytes, urea and glucose, cannot just enter the cell. They are water soluble. They will exert some osmotic effects. Okay, and another function is that on the other hand, the fat-soluble substances like oxygen, fatty acids, and alcohol can pass through the cell membrane with ease because they are fat-soluble. They will dissolve in the membrane and dissolve out, okay, into the cell. So that's how they enter. Let's continue. So we've gone now to the arrangement of proteins within the cell membrane. How are the proteins arranged? Okay, and most protein molecules float about in the phospholipid bilayer, forming a fluid mosaic pattern. The two types of proteins recognized in the cell membrane are: one, we have lipoproteins. Lipoproteins, the proteins contain lipids which function as enzymes and ion channels. So majorly the lipoproteins are forming enzymes, they are forming ion channels, and they are just proteins having some lipid molecule. And we also have glycoproteins. These glycoproteins are proteins containing some carbohydrates, carbohydrates. So they will function as receptors for hormones or receptors for neurotransmitters. Okay, let's continue. So we're going to talk more about the protein arrangement. Alright, we have the glycoproteins and we have the lipoproteins. That is biological structure. So how are they arranged within the cell membrane? We shall have peripheral proteins as we saw in the other diagram. Some proteins are peripheral, and these are present peripheral to the lipid bilayer, both inside and outside to it. Okay? And in the peripheral proteins, we have what we call intrinsic proteins. These proteins are located on the inner surface of the lipid bilayer and mainly will serve as enzymes. Some of these are anchored to the cytoskeleton of the cell. Okay? Some are anchored. There are some proteins which anchor these very proteins to the cytoskeleton, to microtubules, to cytoskeleton of the cell. Okay, so that's how intrinsic proteins, the part of peripheral proteins, are arranged in the cell. They are membranes. They are forming enzymes. All right. Also, we have peripheral proteins which are extrinsic or surface proteins. These are proteins located on the outer surface of the lipid bilayer. These proteins molecules are not associated tightly with the cell membrane, thus can dissociate readily from the cell membrane. and you will find that these are forming the CAMs, covalent cell adhesion molecules. We shall have a video about the cell adhesion. So we shall have a video about cell adhesion molecules. So these extrinsic proteins we can readily dissociate off, and the CAMs are anchoring cells to neighboring cells or to the basal lamina. Alright, and the next video, trust me, will have the cell adhesion molecules. Okay, and integral proteins or transmembrane proteins. Basically, these integral proteins are just as you can see here. Talked about these integral proteins here, as you can see this. And the integral proteins, these are the proteins which extend into the lipid bilayer. They extend into it. And some proteins penetrate only part of the way into the membrane, while others will penetrate all the way through. So you can see this is penetrating all the way through. This one is just penetrating through a portion. Okay, so let's continue. Roles of integral proteins. What are the roles played by integral proteins? Integral proteins can be channel proteins. Alright? These channel proteins are channels for water-soluble substances like glucose and the electrolytes. Okay? These are also called the channel proteins. You get? And the carrier proteins are also integral proteins, which help in transport of substances across the cell membrane by means of active and passive, or call it facilitated diffusion transport. Okay, so carrier proteins are for transport by means of diffusion. All right, but channel proteins are just channels for water soluble substances, call it glucose and electrolytes. Then integral proteins can also be receptor proteins, and some of the proteins function as receptors that bind neurotransmitters and also bind the hormones. Okay, so it will initiate physiological changes inside the cell. All right, let's continue. And number 4, integral proteins might act as antigens. Okay, these antigens are proteins. Some proteins in the cell membrane will be antigens. They are glycoproteins with a branching carbohydrate side chain, like an antenna. Okay, so let's continue. And number 5, integral proteins will be pumps. These are certain proteins in the cell membrane which act as pumps and form active transport system of the cell. As the pumps, you know, we have sodium potassium pump, ATPase pump, potassium hydrogen ATPase pump, or potassium proton pump, and we have calcium pump. All these are integral proteins. Okay, we're going to look at the arrangement of carbohydrates within the cell membrane. How are carbohydrates arranged? The carbohydrates are attached either to a protein or to a lipid, so they will form a glycoprotein or glycolipid. So throughout the surface of the cell membrane, carbohydrate molecules form a loose covering, which we call the glycocalyx. And the functions of these cell membrane carbohydrates: 1, they are negatively charged, and this is very important, that the carbohydrate molecules of the cell membrane do not allow the negatively charged particles to move out of the cell. So negatively charged particles will stay inside the cell. And secondly, the glycocalyx which is formed, it helps in tight fixation of the cells with one another. Alright? And lastly, some of the carbohydrate molecules will function as receptors. So don't you forget to like our videos, subscribe for more and better videos, and share to other students to also enjoy our videos. All right, thank you.